Well, it's December. Last year, I made that DK Pass revamp, but that was all I uploaded that entire month. This year, I want to get to a couple of different projects, the first of which I'm really excited about. Okay, so hear me out. Cool Mountain in Mario Kart DS. Why not? I'll tell you why not, because that's friggin' stupid and impossible. That hasn't stopped me yet, so let's see what we can make. Now, to be totally honest, this was a project that I had massive doubts in. I want to do it so bad, but I probably shouldn't because it could easily take all month to come up with something and then get it into the game. I've never even modded Mario Kart DS before, and I've also never really made a custom track. I've only ever updated existing tracks, and I do have something to work with. It's not completely from scratch, but Cool Mountain still isn't exactly a racetrack. But you know what? I've got to give it a try. I started by making this whole thing as manageable to learn as possible. I found a great tutorial series by Altair Yoshi and downloaded all of the necessary software beforehand. Hopefully this process won't be too overwhelming now that I've got some good guidelines and I won't need to go on intermittent scavenger hunts for software. Alright. Let's get this started. The first thing I did was download the Cool Mountain model from Super Mario 64 DS. It's got a similar art style to Mario Kart DS, so I really won't need to do anything to make it look right at home. Of course, other than turning it into a racetrack and all of that practically undoable stuff. So I got the model imported into Blender and looked it over.
So I need to turn this into a racetrack. I might have to do a lot of changing to this backside of the mountain. So the plan is, we're gonna start right here. And then we can, like, you know, put fence, barricade areas that aren't supposed to be driven on, kind of reshape things where it needs to be reshaped. This is just tricky, because how do you get back here if you're circled in by track going forward?
So there are two things I need to do to turn this into a racetrack. The first and easiest part is to turn what's already here into a drivable track, making sure it's wide enough for multiple racers to drive on. The other thing I'll need to do is create some completely new paths and geometry that visually makes sense and somehow loops us back to the top of the mountain without obscuring existing pathways. So let's just start off by turning what we have into a bit of a racetrack. I know I want to start the race at the top next to the cabin and ride down to the bottom where the other cabin is, so I'll make sure that the pathway to get there looks a little more like a racetrack. After widening the wooden bridge out, I did the same with the path that leads down to the snow, but it actually proved to be pretty tricky working with so few polygons that sometimes share vertices over multiple faces. I also ended up fighting the triangulated faces of the road quite a bit to get a smooth driving surface. I went ahead and filled a face across this gap. I think this is the direction that the track is going to continue in. I also extruded the bottom edges of the mountain down. This being a floating island makes sense in Mario 64, but in Mario Kart, tracks are usually more grounded, so I want this to feel like a real mountain. Then I duplicated a section of that bridge up above and replaced that placeholder face down below. Now I want to keep things somewhat consistent, so I made a little reference card. This probably isn't how big an actual racer will be once I export this, but it will help me know when I've made a path that's too large or too small compared to another section of the track. Let's get back to that wooden ramp that brings you down to the snow. I need to reshape this area a decent bit. It needs to be wide enough to drive on, but it also needs to shoot off to the side of the cabin instead of running into it. Getting this shape down proved to be pretty difficult though. There was a lot of vertices being stuck together and UV maps getting all screwed up, but eventually I had something that I was happy with. Now I can move along and widen out the path a little bit more, and hopefully figure out something that'll somehow get us back up to the starting point. At first, I made this little bridge that covers this small gap, but then I had a better idea for this bridge. Okay, this might not work, but let's just bring this bridge all the way up here. I can get rid of this chunk of the mountain that's in the way and reconstruct a crevice here. Then I can connect the bridge to this ledge. From here, I can figure out a way to make a path back up to the cabin, but let's refine that bridge a little bit more. Obviously, the unwrapping needs some help, but I also need to fine-tune the shape a bit. And while we're over here, I might as well modify this little inset face and add a couple of cabins here since it won't be a race area. But while I was unwrapping the bridge segments, I realized I don't really like how this is just a magical pathway winding up into the air. So I selected a couple of segments of the bridge, extruded their edges downward, and changed some textures around. Now we've got something that these bridges are connected to that'll help keep this path from feeling too tacked on. Now that the bridge is unwrapped, this is looking pretty nice. I'm actually starting to think that this might work. But we have a seemingly impossible path to complete now. First, I decided to get a little bit of other miscellaneous stuff done. I added some boundaries by the end of the descent next to the cabin, and I got rid of the platforming elements in this weird cave area and created an icy floor. After that stuff was looking a little better, I started sizing up that final section of the track. This broken bridge needs to go, and where it's sitting needs to be expanded a bit. Now I'm going to select this face and extrude it out, and put that frozen waterfall material on it. Then I stretched it down along the wall to this ledge. Now I can turn it around the corner and have it blend into that ledge that the wooden bridge leads up to. I am a little bit concerned that this ice path is going to be too steep to drive up, but rather than assume that that's an issue and try to fix it now, I'll just wait and see if it even becomes one. Alright, we've got a track now. I think it's about time to try and get it into Mario Kart DS. I continued on that tutorial series and started on the first step of getting this model ready. Earlier when I installed all of that software, one of the things I got was an NNS material add-on for Blender. I can use it to create NNS materials, which I'm going to need to replace all of my current materials with, since they're formatted the way that Mario Kart DS wants them. So I started with the snow material. And something's not quite right. It seems to be just showing the vertex colors, not the actual texture. I tried making an NNS material for the rock wall to see if that went differently, but it had the same issue. I searched for quite a while for a solution to this, and at some point I noticed that the UV map was named some weird name. So for the sake of simplicity, I just named it UV map, and that was apparently the issue. Well, now the textures are working and we have some vertex colors too, which are a little off in some areas, but they look pretty cool. Notice how parts of the rock wall and snow textures are darker and more blue than others. I haven't ever used vertex colors before this, but I can immediately see how useful these could be. It's basically a way to create some nice artificial lighting, or just create texture variation without doing anything to your textures or making any fancy bake maps. After getting NNS materials made and reassigned for each texture, I went around and had fun painting vertex colors on everything. Shadows under ledges, blue light glowing from the ice. It was so much fun to just paint the lighting onto the model. I tweaked a few little things after that, making this ledge a little higher, getting rid of this rope thing, and creating a pillar of stone that holds up this huge rock ledge. I also got rid of that pit that the star sits in and just froze it over. That way I can get rid of the water material, which was only ever used right here. I also save a few triangles by deleting the geometry. Then I blended that ice with the snow using this transparent snow edge material. I went back to painting vertex colors on the rest of the track, and ended up coming back to the cabins. I painted some orange vertex colors in the corners of the interior, which gave them a nice orange glow inside. I also painted orange on the inside corners of the door and window frames. I think this model is good enough to bring into the game now. It's probably going to need some adjustments, but we won't know what we need to do until we test it out. So I opened a software called Nitro Paint. It's apparently necessary for converting and compressing all of your textures. It was a pretty simple process, similar to importing textures into Track Studio. There's a set of formats that are best suited for certain textures. You have varying sizes of color palettes from 4 to 16 to 256. The goal here is to keep the color palette as simple as possible. So if a 16 color palette doesn't seem to damage the look of your texture, then there's no reason to go up to 256. But if you really need to keep all of the detail in your texture, you can set it all the way up to direct, which won't do any color compression at all. Then you have a couple of other formats, one called A3i5 and A5i3. Both are for textures that have transparency, but A3 is better for keeping color quality, while A5 is better for the quality of the transparency. So I set my snow texture to a 16 color palette, which looked fine. Then I set this fence post texture to A3i5, since it's got a very simple and clear-cut alpha map, but it could benefit from keeping some color depth. But for this snow fade texture here, I went with A5i3, since it's got a more complicated alpha map that sort of fades at the edge. I went down the list and did this for every texture, or at least the ones that I was still using in the model at this point. And once I had every texture exported as a TGA file, I can go into Blender and replace all of the original textures with these. Then I can export the model as a .imd file, which I can then convert to a model and texture file that Mario Kart DS reads. This wasn't working at first, but that was because I had this vertex group sitting here. After deleting that, I was able to get those files just fine, which I can then replace the figure 8 circuits model and texture files with. Alright, now, just like in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, I need to make a KCL collision map for the track. This is generally a simple process of duplicating the model and getting rid of anything that the player won't collide with. But that was actually kinda tough to determine with this track. Well, now that I've got the KCL, I can export it as an OBJ. Now, I'll finally open the main Mario Kart DS modding software, Mario Kart Toolbox. And when I load the ROM and open figure 8 circuit, we have a miniature of Cool Mountain. This was honestly more than I was expecting, so I'm not gonna complain. I headed into the Blender model and scaled it up to times 100, which was actually too big, so I went back and scaled it to times 50, which seems just about perfect. Now I can import the collision map, which is again very similar to Track Studio, but this software actually has a couple of textures set up just based on how I named them, which is pretty crazy. This importing menu pretty much lets you choose how you want different materials to behave in-game, if you want them to be walls or roads, on-road or off-road, and what they should feel and sound like to drive on or crash into. Now I can import the collision model, and I can't see it for some reason. Oh wait, did I ever scale that up? Okay, so I scaled it up to times 50 and re-imported it and set up all of those materials again. But this time there were a few less materials to deal with since I had removed some of them that weren't necessary. There we go. Now all that I have to do is set the starting point for the track. Lakitu might not like me, and if I ever fall off the track, it's anyone's guess where I'll be placed. But the game should open and let me drive around on the track. All I need to do is export the ROM and open it in my DS emulator. Oh no, it actually works. Well, it turns out that weak off-road is not what you should set most of the track to.
Holy crap. So it kinda sucks. The vertex map works too. See the shadows? Let's see if the Easter egg works. Yeah!
But I'm honestly just in disbelief that this worked so quickly. I thought for sure that it would take until next week just to get the track open in-game. But now I can spend next week actually finishing this and making it work properly. You know, making it not off-road and slow and torturous the whole time, and making Lakitu not terrorize you constantly, and making the laps actually count, and making a mini-map that doesn't just show you being all unhinged in Figure 8 Circuit, and making sure that whatever this is doesn't happen, or at least making it a little harder to do. But wow, it's Cool Mountain, raceable in Mario Kart DS. I'm really excited by a lot of things I've learned this week. The fact that I've got a model mostly modded into Mario Kart DS opens all kinds of possibilities. Plus, the friggin' vertex colors are something that I kinda just wanna mess around with in Blender now. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next week when we get this turned into a proper track. I appreciate you watching. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.